Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see everyone here, and welcome to this year's Distinguished Faculty Lecture. And it's truly, this is always a highlight of the year, and again, it's wonderful to be here in person. For nearly a quarter of a century, the Distinguished Faculty Lecture has been a revered tradition at Wellesley, and an opportunity for the college's accomplished faculty members to deliver a public talk that offers a window into their expertise and prompts us to reflect on the values and the value of a liberal arts education. So tonight, it's really my great pleasure to introduce this year's speaker, Ellen Widmer, Mayling Soong Professor of Chinese Studies and Professor of East Asian Languages and Cultures, who will deliver this year's lecture entitled Hidden Trajectories of Talent, Women and Music in 19th-Century China. Professor Widmer is a valued colleague who seeks to foster connection among her peers, an inventive educator who takes pride in bringing the voices of Chinese authors to life for her students, and is a leader in her field who understands the importance of cross-cultural exchange. Professor Widmer studies and teaches the history of Chinese fiction and drama. She has done research in these fields and is also in the history of missionary work in China and the schools and colleges that grew out of this effort. In particular, she has spent her career working to bring greater meaning, visibility, and understanding to women's stories from the 17th to the 19th centuries. This is especially important, she has noted, since though few women wrote fiction in this period, many consumed it and wrote about it in their poetry. Among her many publications, Professor Widmer has authored 3 books, most recently a study of the writings of one literary family and how their work illustrates the shifting attitudes towards women in China in the second half of the 19th century. A Wellesley alumna herself, Professor Widmer left a distinguished career at Wesleyan University in 2007 to return to Wellesley to chair the newly created Department of East Asian Languages and Literatures, now East Asian Languages and Cultures, or EALC. She has had a profound impact here through her expert leadership of the department's programs and faculty. Building on a history of excellence in Chinese and Japanese languages and literature, and adding new strength in Korean languages and culture, over time, EALC has become one of the leading liberal arts college departments in the East Asian field. After graduating from Wellesley, having majored in political science, Professor Widmer went on to earn a master's from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, and her MA and PhD in Chinese literature from Harvard. And I've already said to Ellen that we have to hear more about that journey. Her distinction as a scholar has been recognized by fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Fulbright Program, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Henry Luce Foundation, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. Through stories that approach her topic from 3 different contexts, her lecture today will explore China in the 19th and 20th century and the effects of modernization, with a focus on how Western music swept into China and the vast cultural adjustments that had to be made in the process. Wellesley itself figures into the arc of history, and she will tell, and I'm eager to learn more about that connection. So we are so fortunate to have Professor Widmer as a member of our faculty, and this afternoon we are truly honored to have her share her deep expertise and insights with us. Thank you, Ellen, for being here with us this afternoon.
Well, thanks everyone for coming, and thank you for a lovely, and I don't know if I believe it, but a lovely introduction. Anyway, nice to see you all. And before I start the talk, I just wanted to say I want to dedicate it to my mother-in-law, Carolyn Ladd Widmer, of the class of 1923. And that's exactly 100 years back. And so that's my first step back into the past. I'll go a little farther, and then I'll come back. I have my very last slide happened only 2 weeks ago, so you'll see it's going to be quite a sweep. And as I say, I'm going to have trouble mastering my presentation, but I will try. So I had prepared to read it, and I don't think with this size group it's going to make too much sense to do that, but at least every now and then I have a pithy paragraph that I would like to read. So I'm going to start with a pithy paragraph, and then we'll see what happens after that. At Wellesley, we normally think of talent as an asset, but for women in traditional China, especially the Qing dynasty, 1644 to 1911, it was regarded as a problem. There were long debates on the topic that ended up concluding that lack of talent in a woman is a virtue. Of course, there were plenty of people that disagreed. In the world of women, the word talent could mean several things. Talent at writing, talent at painting were both regarded as threatening to domestic harmony, even to a woman's health. But embroidery was not deemed a threat, even though it was a field that one could be talented in, for sewing of all kinds fell into the category of a virtue, something that would support a woman's family and marriage and keep her from taking herself too seriously. So my talk today begins in those old times. In the first section, it's going to focus on a new theater for women's talent, an ancient Chinese instrument known as the zither. So the zither, and in Chinese, the guqin, and I just wanted to point out, I won't do it in the rest of the talk, but that the Chinese name for the piano, the gongqin, there's a relationship between those two. I won't go into it, but it is there. And my second section is going to be about missionaries, and my third section is going to be about Boxer indemnity students that came to the Seven Sisters schools, including Wellesley. So I'm going to glue those things together and see if it all comes out as it should. Here I go with and first I wanted to make two other points in my introduction. As I said in my title, I'm interested in trajectories of talent. I'm not interested in isolated cases, but in groups. And they could be groups of people that knew each other, or they could be groups of people that were part of the same movement, didn't know each other because that movement, especially the missionary movement, happened over a long number of years. But I'm not just going to do individual cases, and I'll show you that as we get closer. And my second introductory point is that there's something hidden about all three of my trajectories. So mostly I mean by that they were lost from view, from sight, for various reasons, and I'll try to tell you what those reasons were. I'm going to start now in my first section, which is about the zither. And just to give you a little bit of the sound of it and the look of it. I just wanted to give you a little idea, and I'll go over some of its characteristics. It's a plucked instrument with 7 strings, originally made of silk. It's placed on a table. The right hand plucks and the left hand stops. The so-called organology or social life of this instrument is that it was associated primarily with male scholars, and it is very ancient, dating back to the time of Confucius, the 6th century BC, and earlier. It's not very loud, and in the past it was usually played solo, or perhaps with another zither or flute. It is very difficult to learn to play well. It is often played in a natural setting, such as a grove or near a lake, quite often at night. Traditionally, it's associated with contemplation, moral purity, and deep friendship. And there's a famous anecdote about a a pair of people, one of whom played and the other of whom listened. And when the listener died, the player stopped playing. So it's associated with, and through all of that, it's become sort of common to say that two soulmates, if they're really good soulmates, they understand one another's sound. It comes from this instrument. A lot more could be said by way of introduction, but in 1940, a well-known book on the subject in English runs to 271 pages. But I don't think I'm going to bother with all those pages. I'm just going to stop now and show you a few more pictures. Okay, that is to show you how old it is. That's a very old stone carving, but Confucius was quite a bit before that, but just to show you. And then I want to show you a picture of by the Soong Emperor Huizong of someone playing his zither out in nature. And the idea seems to be that by nighttime, all the bad people had gone to sleep or something like that. So you could have the purity that you wanted and the contemplation that you wanted in playing this instrument. So these are the characteristics. You don't have to memorize them or anything, but just bear it all in mind, that it's quiet, it's ancient, and so forth. It's a little bit remote from our way of thinking or our taste in music, but I thought I ought to introduce it. And the seventh strings things. You can help me with this. In classical literature, the strings are often referred to as red, and I'm not sure why. At the very, very last slide, when I get to the last one, you'll see some strings, and you can look at them and see if you think they are red. I don't really think so, but that's what they're called anyway. So that's the introduction. Okay, I'm going to be talking about elite women, and that means gentry women. They were cloistered, and they had bound feet, and though they could walk, they could not travel freely outside their homes. But the confinement didn't mean that they didn't use their minds. Beginning around 1600, approximately 200 years before my talk begins, in certain parts of China, it became fashionable for such women to develop their skills in poetry and painting. It was in this part of China, the Jiangnan part of China. Okay. And for a strange reason, it suddenly thought that skills in painting and poetry might help people to get married, might help enhance their marriageability, and a whole category of women teachers, the teachers of the inner chambers, came into being. Often the teachers were gentry women too, but for one reason or another, they needed to support themselves, which they could do by teaching others certain skills. And around the time my story begins, which is 1800, women started to add music to the list of talents. There's quite a bunch of inhibitions that grow up around all of this. The idea being that painting and poetry had more or less established themselves as okay things for smart women to do. But the music thing, it really gave rise to worries about things. And there's a woman, for example, who became very good at the zither, but she gave up the instrument because she didn't think it was feminine enough. And then another one who had a very high level of achievement, but she was actually very filial to her mother-in-law, respectful to her father-in-law, never arrogant about her artistic talent. But she didn't live out her full span of years. She died at the age of 23. And the problem may have been that she was just too talented. If she hadn't had all that talent, or if she hadn't enjoyed her talent, she might have lived a lot longer. But if you learned how to play the zither at home, if your mother or father taught you, it meant that your mother and father already knew how. Of course, they couldn't teach you if they didn't know how. And sometimes in that context, around 1800, it started to be more okay for women to learn to play the zither. I forgot to tell you, why the zither for women when it's such a hard instrument? It's because there were four painting, poetry, chess, and music. Those four arts were thought to be the arts for a gentleman to learn, and the women always wanted to learn things that the gentlemen thought were important. And so the zither came along, and when the gentleman wanted to learn music, it was always the zither, not the peepaw or something more lowly. So that's why women started getting interested. Okay, I put together a bunch of families that from this time I just looked through all the literature. You can find mothers that taught their sons. You can find mothers that taught their daughters. You can find fathers that taught son and daughters from particularly beginning around this time. And what might the reason for that be? Why all of a sudden would you start to have all this activity in music? And I think it was, for the women anyway, mainly because there were two very famous teachers of women around this time, and one of them in particular encouraged women's music. I think that is probably the most important reason. But also the Manchus. The Qing dynasty was a Manchu dynasty, and the Manchus took the zither very seriously. And there's a kind of pronouncement by a Manchu woman of some status saying that if women are going to learn to play a musical instrument, it has to be the zither. It cannot be the more commonplace instrument like the peepaw. So all of those things kind of added up. So this is one woman I found, and I found some of her students, and I found, this and that about her. But here is a poem by her, on a moonlit night, hearing my two daughters play the zither. And she says, 2 zithers side by side near the beautiful studio. Red strings, and here are those red strings again. 14 in all, harmonized together. And I told you there were 7 strings on the zither, but here you have 14. It's because, of course, there are 2 daughters. 2 hearts, mutually imprinted, produce sounds in accord. A beautiful luan bird will surely descend from heaven. And this is the luan bird. It's a mythical bird. It looks to me remarkably like a pheasant or something, but it's a mythical bird, and it is thought that when people play the zither well, either a luan bird or a dragon would descend from heaven. That's just the mythology about it. And there's also the idea that if you play the zither well, that cranes aren't exactly mythological, but they're sort of favored birds. If you play your zither really well, they'll come out from wherever they are and dance. And they'll find you. They'll dance over. They'll kind of find you in your room or wherever you are outside and dance. So that's the idea here, and that's just to show you what a lot of mythology there was associated with this instrument. Okay, now let me just, since at the end of every section, I'm going to tell you what was hidden or what was problematic here about this. This is the end of part 1, so I'm going to tell you about the problem here. For one thing, women's records were kept very nicely in China, but they were hard to use. And it was only in the mid-20th century that a really good catalog came out and made it much easier for people to access this material. So that's one reason that it's been easier to work on topics like this now. It's not easy, but it's easier. And the other factor, I think, is the attitude of Christian missionaries who wanted to believe that life in China for Chinese women changed dramatically because of them. That the missionaries came and all of a sudden, abracadabra, things were much better for Chinese women. And they didn't take any note of things like changes toward art and music around 1600 or changes toward music around 1800. They just wanted to believe that things had always been the same until they came along. So I don't believe that any of this work on teachers of the inner chambers or all the activities women went through could have happened when that mindset of the missionaries still held sway. So now, and I forgot to show you Hu Xiangduan's fans. There's all sorts of things that get auctioned out there online, and here are 2 of her fans still available. I think they've been sold. If you wanted to buy it, it might be too late, but they're out there anyway. And just to show, only to show that if a person was good at music, they had to be good at poetry and painting too. You couldn't just have the one without the others. There were a few itinerant musicians who taught only music, but they weren't in the high classes themselves. Okay, so now we have to think about the missionaries. That's part 2. And what happens, by way of introduction, I want to mention the Taiping Rebellion, which really destroyed the old gentry culture of Jiangnan region and wiped out efforts begun by women like Hu Xiangduan. The rebellion ended when British, French, and other troops helped the dynasty to put it down. The dynasty was too weak to do it by itself. And one of the stipulations of the treaties concluding this disorder was that many new cities were opened to missionary efforts, and not just cities, but the countryside as well. Previously, it had just been a few cities that missionaries could work in, but after this treaty, of course, in Chinese history, considered a very unequal treaty, the whole world of missionary activity opened up. And in the meantime, the American Civil War had lent momentum to the idea of women who were capable, who could raise money for the troops. They did in great numbers. And they held the fort at home when their husbands were away. And so the idea of active, capable women was kind of emerging in America too. And as missionaries in China rethought their options in 1858 and later, they began to realize they really needed more women because of cloistering, and the missionary men could not go into the homes of Chinese women. It just wasn't allowed. So they really felt they had to have women, and all these factors joined together and added a huge number of new missionaries and a huge number of women missionaries to the mix. And previously, there really hadn't been single women who were missionaries, just maybe a few. And mostly it was the wives of the missionaries, but it was suddenly just now kind of a flood. And my discussion in this section is going to focus on just two missionaries. The first one of them is this one, Julia Brown Mateer. And you notice my little footnote because in this part of the talk, I borrowed work from a Chinese scholar in New Zealand, very helpful about what Mateer was able to do. And just so you know where she worked, she was in Shandong province, which is the upper right of the two provinces that are there. I'll have another version of the map for you, but just so you can keep your eye on her. She was married to a male missionary leader in Shandong, and she had almost no education at all in the United States. She did go to a couple of seminaries. She must have finished high school, I guess, and then went to seminaries. But she didn't have any elaborate education at all. But she loved church music. And she really wanted to help in the idea. The missionary felt very strongly that to introduce Chinese people to hymns would make them love hymn music, and then they would want to become Christians. And she was a great leader in that effort. She wrote a book called Rudiments of Western Music in 1872, and she explains all about Western music to her Chinese subjects. And the name of the book was later changed to Anthology of Sacred Hymns. I wanted to point out, in case I forget to tell you, that her Chinese was very good. And these missionaries who stayed in China for 20, 30, 40 years also often had almost native, not quite, but really, really good Chinese. So she wrote her book in Chinese. And it was widely used in all sorts of missionary classrooms. And I wanted to just describe what she identified as the differences between Chinese and Western music. Let's see if I can do that now. Okay. So she, first of all, the instruments, not the zither anymore, of course, but the piano. And pianos had been in China for a while. Since the Jesuits were in China, they had been pianos in China. But Emperor Kangxi played the harpsichord, apparently. But it hadn't caught on. And once this big missionary movement began, everybody wanted to send a piano to China. So pianos were arriving, and organs, reed organs. I'm not sure what a reed organ is exactly, but anyway, they're organs that are sort of portable. And those instruments arrived in big numbers. Then another thing is the second big difference is that Chinese music is largely pentatonic, 5-tone, as opposed to diatonic. You can overdo the distinction, but that's an important difference. And then the third point of difference is musical notation. China had notation too, but not the Western kind, with treble clef, bass clef, the staff, ledger lines, rests, and all that business. The old Chinese system worked perfectly well as a means of recording music, the missionaries thought, not as useful as a teaching tool. There's some disagreement about that. Anyway, just so you know, that was a big difference, and the Chinese converts had to learn the new system of writing music. Now, the fourth point is singing. China had had singing, of course, for centuries and centuries, but it had not had choral singing. It had solo singing in operas and all sorts of things, but choral singing, not so much. Well, of course, people who sang folk songs sang them together, but the idea of four-part harmony, in a choral situation was new. And the last difference is education. In the new system, music will be taught by a teacher in a classroom. At first, the only people in the classroom were boys, but eventually they became girls too. As opposed to Hu Xiangduan's day, when tutoring was done by one individual to another one individual. So it's a really very, very different system that's coming into effect. And Julia Mateer's book, her Anthology of Sacred Hymns, brings all of this to the fore. It sort of explains it. It's sort of a hymnal. It has hymns in it, but it also has questions she uses a question-answer format, which is very normal for missionaries. What is a chord? What is a scale? And then she'll answer that. That's how the book is written. So the book is more than just a hymnal. It's really an introduction to Western music. And then just to tell you, there were some decisions that had to be made in putting the book together. You might be interested. I'll just run through a few of them. Things like, should the words of the hymns be transcribed into dialect or into classical Chinese, which is not a spoken language, or in Mandarin Chinese, which was Mateer's choice. And then the question, this will seem maybe too fussy to you, but how to situate do, as in do, re, mi, so, fa. And so should it be fixed? Should it be a fixed note in every case, or should it be flexible? And Mateer's choice was flexible. Should attention be paid to songs already popular among Chinese, or should only Christian tunes be allowed? Mateer went for a hybrid approach in her effort to make learning as easy as possible for converts or potential converts. And as you can see in this page from her book, she sometimes even used the old Chinese system for conveying music along with the Western system. The one on the right uses some of the old system in addition to the Western system. She mixes it up so that people will be able to absorb it a little better. Most of the missionaries in her day, or many of them anyway, thought that Chinese music was barbarous music of the most agonizing quality, so that it would have been better if it had never been written. That's what people thought. But Mateer argues that the fact that what is music to one people is hideous noise to another only shows the diversity of tastes, not that any one people are destitute of the musical facility. And her book was a wild success. It worked in classroom after classroom, and not just in Shandong, all across China. There were other books too. It wasn't the only one, but it was important. Now, the other missionary I want to introduce is Gertrude Baylis, and she's a lot later in the history. Mateer died in 1898, and Baylis is born in 1890. So you see there's quite a difference. So Baylis comes in a later phase of missionary activity, one that's much less evangelical and much more education-minded. One does not find the word heathen in her book, although it occurs in writings of Mateer's time. And whereas Mateer was married to a prominent missionary in Dengzhou, Shandong, Baylis was single and spent her time far away from Dengzhou, and that's the more lower and the more left, in Hunan province. And she studied piano and languages in Iowa. She taught piano in Iowa. And in 1923, she was asked to go to China. I think the Board of Foreign Missions was recruiting musicians for work with Chinese people. She taught in a school called Fuxiang, and that was part of the Yale in China network in Changsha. She's not nearly as well known as Mateer, not nearly. Mateer is a famous missionary, not Baylis. But Baylis caught my eye because of two publications. Was this magazine called the Etude, which was there for, it was a magazine for musicians. And in it, she wrote her article on the the strange lure of Chinese music. So she's one of the first crop to start explaining Chinese music to Westerners. And you can see it's full of illustrations and things like that. But then, in addition, and what really interested me was that she had a diary of about 55 pages, very, very single-spaced, and way off to the margins on each side. So I think she must have been saving money on paper or something. But it details her experiences as a music teacher and paints a vivid picture of what it was like to try and teach music through the range of conditions that China was experiencing. And these included, the negatives were civil war, bombing, sickness, and inflation. But there was also joy at holiday times and pride at the ability of the choir to raise money for the school. Her love of adventure and of China caused her to return to the country many times, despite all the inconveniences and discomforts. I don't think her reading and writing skills were as good as Mateer's, but her conversation appears to have been excellent. And it was sufficient to do the job she wanted to do, and that included teaching piano and organ, teaching choral singing, organizing a choir, conducting the choir, playing the organ for church services, giving concerts on the piano, or performing in trios with a violinist and cellist, and translating hymns into Chinese. She also repaired pianos. And for a time, she was even pressed into service as an English teacher, which seemed okay to me. But then as the treasurer of her girls' school, I hope she knew how to do that well enough. It didn't sound as though she did, but they were desperate. Okay, so what I thought I could do now is think about the 5 points I talked about earlier with Mateer and see how they came out several decades later in Baylis's long account. I don't think that Mateer ever tried to learn Chinese instruments, but Baylis did. Baylis was interested in Chinese instruments. She learned both the deeds of the Chinese flute and the erhu, the 3-string lute. I don't think she wanted to be an expert, but she just thought they were fun. So, and that was not anything. Well, it's a little hard to say because I don't have the same kind of account from Mateer. She may have, but I think it would have been very unlikely. On the second point, the 5-tone versus the 12-tone scale, so she goes beyond that simple distinction to bring in some nuances, to say China has the 12-tone scale too, but it was organized a little differently. She shows how the half note, where the half notes were, and they're in a little bit different place and so forth. And she says several instruments, including the zither, can operate on the 12-tone scale. Okay, on the third point, she noted that and people would not have agreed with her, people do not agree with her on this one, that the old Chinese system is quite defective, the old system of notation, particularly in the matter of time marks. Many people say this, but the experts do not agree. The signs indicate a certain sound at a certain pitch, but they leave the reader in doubt as to its value. That's what she said, but that is not agreed with. On the fourth and fifth points, choral singing and teaching, Baylis's other work, her diary turned narrative, gives some idea of the fun to be had in teaching and singing, or at least the lived experience. And she says things like, these are just quotes, "The students were anxious to learn Western music, and they had aptitude and diligence that would thrill any teacher. At the end of each semester, the piano students gave a recital. It was a big occasion for them, and equally so for me. They were eager and hardworking, and the results were encouraging. Every time I learned what to do and what not to do in teaching." Then she talks about a concert the Yale students and the Fuxiang students gave together with 1,000 people attending each one, and the chorus sang the Hallelujah chorus, and the audience stood, and we thought it was an historic occasion for West Hunan. And then she concludes her article with the thought that one of the most appealing calls of China is its music. Listening to the people at work and play and worship, we need not be puzzled at the assertion that the Chinese are the most musical people in the world. You can see that by now music has become, in her work, it's everywhere. Music is no longer just church music. There's a lot of secular. There are a lot of concerts being given, and music seems to have taken hold in a much bigger way, with many, many Chinese musicians performing too. And none of this talk about it would have been better if Chinese music had never been written. None of that at all in what she's talking about. But even after 1949, even after 1949, when the nationalists had been defeated and the communists were taking control, it was just at that time that all foreigners were being expelled. Some communist youth came to her and asked her to play some Russian music because they wanted to know what it sounded like. They wanted to have the Western music, just not the Christian influence and all the imperialism. And she had fun with that request because she was on the side of the nationalists, not the communists. And she said, well, she said secretly to herself, I'm just going to play some Tchaikovsky. And they loved it. And Tchaikovsky wasn't at all what they had in mind, but they didn't know, so she got away with it. So that was sort of interesting. Now, and wait a minute. What is hidden about this trajectory? First of all, it's difficult to use missionary sources because there's such a big tie to imperialism. So missionary work is not terribly widely studied. But some of the best institutes studying what missionaries are actually in China. And I myself gave a talk for them on medical missionaries not too long ago. They've been doing really, really good work. Just in general, that is a point I wanted to make. But then about why these two women sort of faded from view. Matir, she didn't fade from view, but her book faded from view because it was so anomalous. It was a work in Chinese by a missionary. There are not very many of those. And so it faded away until it was rediscovered by this scholar that I have mentioned, Hong Gongyu. And as for Baylis, her article introducing Chinese music to Westerners is on a list of important articles in that area, but her diary is held in a denominational library, and nobody reads it. I really felt it was a shame when I was reading it preparing for this talk, that it wasn't better known, and I'd love to see if I can do something about it later on. Now I'm moving to my third section, which is about the Boxer Rebellion. And this is just a few facts. It was a revolt against missionaries, and it was mostly peasants, but they were supported by people in power, sort of covertly. Not that many people were killed, but it seemed like a lot at the time, 200 to 300. And the punishment, once again, as with the Taiping Rebellion, was huge. It was just huge punishments, indemnities that the government couldn't possibly pay. And America decided to be a little bit lenient and turn some of those into scholarships for Chinese students to come to America. Of course, China still had to pay. But America also gave up some of the indemnities. And I wanted to tell you about the very first crop of students, 47 students who were all men, won the prize. It was very, very competitive in 1909. And it was a few years later that students and others started to protest that women weren't allowed to take part. So women were finally allowed. And in the first class of that, there are 10 of them selected in 1914. And the plan was that after that 10 would be selected every other year. So that was the idea. And all 10 in the first group attended Seven Sisters schools. 4 went to Wellesley, 2 each at Vassar and Mount Holyoke, and 1 each at Smith and Radcliffe. And I think one probable measure of the impact of missionary teaching of music may be that 4 of the women in this first group of 10 chose music as their major. And in fact, I'm going to give you a possible 5th person in that group that may have been a music major. And we can assume that the 10 women had close contact with missionaries in China because it was only at missionary schools that students could develop a high enough proficiency in English to permit admittance to Seven Sisters schools. Okay, 2 of the 4 music majors and 2 others ended up at Wellesley. Each of the 4 students who came to Wellesley yields insight into one or another of the cross currents of the day. I'm going to review all 4 of them and then look at the other 2 music majors. This is the first student. They all used Romanizations that are not used anymore. And so this student is known as Yiling Tung, and her dates, we know her dates, 1894 to 1980. We don't know all of the dates. She was a music major, and I put her courses there for you to look at. I had a lot of help, by the way, in making this talk from the president's office and from LTS and from the archives, but I thought the archives were so conscientious because they said they could tell me what she took, but they would not give me her grades. And I thought that was wonderful. And I said, okay. I mean, I didn't want her grades anyway. I never even thought to ask for her grades. But she majored in music. I'll see if I can do this without reading because it's faster. She majored in music and graduated, and then she married a man who was a very successful banker and who went all around to Burma, Malaysia, New York, Shanghai, opening banks. He was very, very successful. And of all the students, she was the one that was the most engaged in writing back to her class. If any of you are alums, you know that every now and then you have to send in news and that kind of thing. She sent in news all the time. Never news about music, never at all about music. It was only about her children, and I think she must have led a rather grand life because she wrote back on one occasion to say, my first son can say mama and papa, and he also knows the names of all the servants. And then she went on to say, and he can speak a few words of Malay because he's been talking to the chauffeur. So she was up there socially, let's say. And I don't know if that's why she kept in touch with her class. I don't know at all. But she kept in touch with her class. Most of her work, her career was spent with the Y. She did a lot of things, sort of socially active things with the YWCA, and then with a China Women's Relief Organization, which raised money for orphans during the war. But she didn't, as far as I could see, go any farther with her music degree. She did have one daughter that went to Wesleyan College in Georgia, I think it is. Not Wesleyan University, but the other college that the Soong family sent many people to. And so at least she taught her daughter how to play the piano, I think. She must have been a good pianist. She gave concerts when she was in America. But what I wanted to say about her was that I think each of these 4 Wellesley students tells us something interesting about the currents of the day. And one thing I was going to say about this particular student was that the ethos of the time was that women really shouldn't get educated for themselves. They should do it for their husband and children and the next generation, but they shouldn't be egomaniacs. And I think she may have absorbed a little of that. And some of her classmates too, I believe. She must have, I think she had a happy life. I wouldn't doubt that at all. But she didn't make a career out of music. Okay, the second one is, something is wrong. They added a funny last name to her. I don't know quite how that came about, but anyway, here she is. They look so handsome in their photographs. I really think they're quite wonderful. And she is declared in Chinese sources to be an economics major. But I'm going to go right to my next slide. She really didn't major in economics. She had only 3 courses. And she had all these courses in music. And so I don't know. What my hypothesis is here, that the officials recommended that women major in fields they thought would be compatible. So art was one, music was one. You'd be surprised at the others. Well, teaching maybe you wouldn't be surprised, but medicine was one that they recommended as a nice compatible major with being a mother. It doesn't sound quite right. But anyway, I think this person may have decided that she had to major in music in order to be a good person or something. And then once she got to Wellesley, she got interested in economics because she did have the economics. But look at, she had her major in music was the same, almost exactly the same as the other student. So I thought that was kind of interesting. That was my little discovery in the archives. And then the third student here, she had, I can never handle all these names, but anyway, her dates are 1893 to 1971. She focused more on the piano. She she transferred out of Wellesley in her senior year to become a full-time student at the New England Conservatory of Music. And her program there, it's amazing what you can know. You can know what everybody took. So I even know what she took at the New England Conservatory of Music. So she took more advanced, more technical courses in music, such as harmonics, counterpoint, and composition. She took all of those. And she was quite a performer. She performed in this area. And she went back to China, then she came back and took more work at the New England Conservatory, and then she took conducting and writing songs. And she had a very good career. She went back to China and founded a school in Shanghai. And she turned out a number of performers. She herself didn't perform much in China, but she turned out some leading pianists in China, and also wrote a number of songs for children and books on music pedagogy. She had a husband and 4 children, and the girls all learned how to play the piano, and the boys all learned how to become conductors in the Army, for whatever that's worth. Then the 4th student is this one, and she majored in physical education. It was a wonderful field in its day. It was especially important in China because all these people were coming out from their bound feet, and and the idea of women exercising was so new. And she also made a bit of a splash because she protested that the track teams didn't have women on them, and she wanted male-female equality. That was what she was known for. She took no music courses at all. Okay, then I'm going to turn to the other 2 music majors, one from Vassar. This is the Vassar person. I don't know what she took. I have to go to the archives. Maybe I could find out. She didn't make any visible contributions to the music field. She returned to Shanghai, taught English and music at a denominational school, and then the evidence just kind of disappears. I don't really know what happened. But this one person here, I know that's not an undergraduate picture, obviously, but it's I'm going to call her Jo just because that's the Mandarin romanization. It's like the pattern we had with Wang of somebody really making a splash in her field. And she was quite a writer. She really had, I found an account by her of, I guess I won't read it to you. I had been going to if I were reading more, but it's all about how she and some other Chinese girls went to a host family to spend Christmas Eve and Christmas. And they walked in the door, and the host family had laid everything out so beautifully. Her title, by the way, is Life in a Rich American Home, or something like that. They had really done a good job, and so the girls decided they were going to sing some Christmas carols to the family. So they got up in the middle of the night, and none of them quite knew the song, but one of the girls had a very good memory, and they got the, whatever it was, I forgot which one it was. Let me see. Oh, Joy to the World. They wrote out Joy to the World and sung it in Shanghai dialect, and they figured that the host wouldn't know, because if they sang it like 10 times, as if it had 10 verses, the host wouldn't know because they didn't know Chinese. And then they sang Silent Night, Holy Night in English, and they got up at 4 a.m. and sang all of that stuff. And then at breakfast, the host and the rest of the people there were very, very appreciative of all these angels that had sung so well. But there's a really nice account of that in a magazine, some remote thing I found online. But her real contribution was in vocal music, teaching, and conducting. She had a project incorporating melodies from traditional Chinese operas and turning them into Chinese art songs. So not a Schubert-like art song, but an art song with a Chinese flair. She did a lot of that work. And she took up the study of the zither, which she learned to play, and the tunes she learned how to she wanted to transcribe into Western notation. And I think together these two can be thought of as extensions or continuations of the missionary efforts to bring Western-style music into China, but without the same evangelical agenda. Wang's encouragement of performance and Zhou's modernized art songs appear as particularly successful improvements on projects the missionaries had begun. Their deeper knowledge of Chinese language and culture would have allowed more cutting-edge integration of Chinese and Western styles. Okay, so now I'm at the end of this one, so I'm going to tell you about hidden things. I wanted you to be sure to say that it wasn't only missionaries that brought Western music to China, that China had quite a pattern of following the Japanese government. And this is a Japanese print from 1889. I don't know if you can even tell that those people are Japanese in the picture. They look so Western. They're wearing bustles under their dresses, but they are supposed to be Japanese. So somebody at the piano and a little choir and all that was from 1889, which is before my Western students part of the paper ever begins. So just so you can see that Western music was coming into China by other methods. Furthermore, from that example I gave you about Russia, Russia was another way it could come in without the same imperialist agenda. And then, well, I end up telling you what happened to Wang and Zhou. Wang eventually went to the States to live with a daughter, and Zhou stayed through the Cultural Revolution. She faced quite a lot of trouble, but after it all, she was completely rehabilitated and praised for her work on songs. Her big contribution was on songs, and her contribution to religious music and her conducting of choirs. So, okay, now I'm at my takeaways. So the role of Western music in bringing, the role of women in bringing Western music to China. And I think both Westerners and Chinese, I have to give people like Matir credit, I think. China has had to recover from unpleasant associations between Western music and imperialism. But now it's a leading manufacturer of pianos, one of the leading ones in the world. And as a result, the foreign manufacturers of pianos like Steinway, which is American, like Yamaha, which is Japanese, have benefited hugely from all this interest. There was a period during the Cultural Revolution where China hated pianos and tried to destroy them, but that has completely changed. And the zither, too, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the zither. It, too, suffered a period of hatred and destruction because people felt it was too old-fashioned. But it has now come back, too, and it's a wonderful sort of people like it because it can inject a Chinese voice into this kind of multicultural world we live in. It is quite a lot of people are studying it, and the number of people who play it who are women they now apparently outnumber men. However, some of the same old things, the same thing about sitting up straight and wearing a formal dress and burning incense are still practiced. I had some students in one of my classes who told me this. The only thing I forgot to ask was whether they still expect a dragon or a luan bird or a crane to come along and dance. I don't think so. I think that phase has probably passed. But I wanted just to end on the note that that you could keep your eye on this zither. I don't know if I persuaded you to like the zither when I first introduced it, but I just want you to know a lot of experimentation has been going on with not silk strings anymore, but metal strings. And electric zithers exist now, and I wanted to end with two sort of ways of showing you what else is going on here. Let's see if I can do this properly. I'm going to turn it off. And also, I told you, I promised you, I think at the beginning, if I remembered, to tell you this, that I was going to give you something from just 2 weeks ago, less than. Oops.
Comment s'appelle ce morceau?
这个曲叫什么呢？
流水。
流水就是高山流水，千年古琴呐、 奏的是这个千年绝唱，高山流水盼知音呐、它是一个古代的一个很优美的故事，俞伯牙与钟子期的故事，体现是知音，只有知音才能听得懂它这个曲子。
Je prendrai moi le nom du morceau avec les textes, si vous pouvez me les récupérer.
总统想把这个曲子的名字记下来。
记一下可以，包括曲名或者你有那个简谱的那个，可以复印一下。可以
Okay, so my last one is just to thank the people, and there are many that helped me, and thank you.
Ellen, thank you. Thank you for that tour de force. And I thought that as you followed and traced the history of music and women in China, and thinking about their trajectory, and then to end with the zither and a woman playing Western music on a zither.
Yes, and then for Xi Jinping.
Yeah, and then for Xi Jinping. So thank you. We're going to just take a couple of questions. We have time for a couple of questions.
Yes.
My name is Ted Widmer. Thank you for the talk. There was a page of musical notation,
Yeah.
or there were 2 pages, and I wondered, was that book printed in China, and was it difficult to print musical notation? That page had Western and Chinese ideas on it.
That's a topic in itself. The printing, the missionary printing was very elaborate at that time. Yes, it would have been printed in China, I'm sure. It couldn't have been printed in America. But you might know more about that.
Oh, I know about before 1834.
Oh, okay, okay, okay. But don't you think I'm right about missionary, even the music, even all that? I don't think it went to America because it was written in Chinese.
Yeah, there was so much infrastructure developed around printing.
Right, they really knew how. So probably in Shanghai. Yeah. Yep.
Can I ask you, Ellen, this is not about your talk, but when I introduced you, no, I am fascinated by the fact that you majored in political science, went to the Fletcher School, and then ended up getting your PhD and becoming a scholar. Can you just share a little bit about that journey? I think it's so important for our students to hear with different trajectories.
I tried to do, Andy and I talked about this once. I tried to put in, you noted, I put in some of these students that came to, they were big honor to come to Wellesley, and they all loved Wellesley. And then this student who said she majored in music, but she didn't, well, or the Chinese word is she majored in econ. And I could see it. I could see that she was starting an econ major, even though she was kind of stuck in a music major that she didn't like. So people do get in majors that they don't like. And don't you think? Yeah.
Is hygiene considered one of those?
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. But that person liked her major, as far as I know. But what's so amazing to me is just this day, doing research in this day and age when there's so much on the internet that you can find out if I were you, I probably could go to the archives and get those people's grades from 1914. But of course, I didn't want to. But it's just, but something like that is what allows me to contradict what you find in China and what you find in America. The record wasn't parallel. In my own case, as I was telling Paula earlier, I didn't have much advice when I was at Wellesley, and I became a political science major. I had I had one thing in mind. I wanted to be sure to do something that I couldn't have done in high school, and there was no political science in high school. I also thought it sounded so cool. And then I got to Wellesley, and all these really cool people were majoring in political science. And Madeleine Albright was about my time, and she and these others were doing that, and I thought that was going to be my trajectory. But then somehow reality caught hold of me, and how China entered the picture is a longer story, but I didn't think that political science was going to do it for me. I kind of thought I'd go into the Foreign Service, but it just didn't interest me that much. And when I finally discovered China, which was quite a while after Wellesley, not just the year after Wellesley, but a while after Wellesley, when I finally found it, I just loved it, and I simply couldn't put it down. And that was never how I felt about political science. And I have no gripe at all with political science. I think political science is absolutely fine, but it just wasn't for me. That's all. So I identified with this student that started out in music for probably the wrong reasons. And she added econ. I mean, it just looks so funny to me that you can major in econ with only 3 courses. And then then somebody said, some wise person said to me, well, probably she just told people in China that she majored in econ. Because who's going to know, except little, right?
Ellen, thank you. Thank you so much, really, for just, as I said, a tour de force, and for really leaving Wesleyan to come here to lead our department, and for really being such not only a remarkable scholar and teacher, but really a leader here that has helped to catapult Wellesley in such an important way in this field. So thank you.
Thank you so much.